Now, moving on, global food security has steadily worsened over the past several years. According to the 2022 Global Report on Food Crisis, nearly 193 million people experienced crisis level or worse food insecurity in 2021, an increase of almost 40 million over the previous record in 2020. The number identified in the 2022 edition is the highest in the report's 6-year existence. The negative food security outlook is projected to continue or worsen this year, and the ongoing conflicts in Ukraine and resulting disruption to food, fuel and fertilizer markets has exacerbated an existing food crisis driven by conflict, climatic shocks, COVID-19 and economic pressures. To address this impending crisis, analysts and industry watchers maintain that comprehensive solutions must be provided to address the impacts of food insecurity on the country. And for further analysis, we're joined by Mr. Vayala Kwaga, the senior analyst at Budget Foundation. He joins us now. Hello, Mr. Vayala.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Good to have you on board. Well, this is what we're faced with, and we're looking at in the face of this rising insecurity and looming food crisis. How responsive has government in Africa been? I mean, African government generally.
The governments in Africa have had their various methods and approaches to dealing with food insecurity. Oftentimes, it's a mix of fiscal and monetary policies. And the trend is to apply those governance tools, those macroeconomic governance tools, in measures that ensure that the markets and the suppliers are able to meet in an optimal setting. Using Nigeria as an example, we see that there was like a slight difference or a slight trend improvement in allocation to the agricultural sector. But the challenges remain in terms of actually closing the gap as it concerns food security. Data available to me as of today says that about 12.94 million people were in acute food insecurity between October and December 2021. That's for Nigeria. I don't have the figures for the rest of the continent. But looking at Africa's most populous nation, it may not bode well for other countries that may not even be applying as much of their national budgets to closing those food security gaps that exist.
All right, well, the global hunger crisis is felt most by vulnerable and marginalized people, with limited capacity to absorb additional shocks. You've talked about the fact that, government in Africa, they are doing different things, monetary, fiscal policies and all of that. And then when we look at this particular issue, Africa clearly falls within this context. Do you think there are moves to expand our capacity to absorb this imminent crisis? Because what works is when you're able to absorb, the shock that's coming.
Yes, I think that there certainly are moves. At least there is some buzz around how much has been given out to farmers in Nigeria, for example, through the various agricultural credit guarantee schemes and the loans from the CBN, the Anchor Borrowers Program, and then spending on dams and irrigation facilities in some northern parts of the country, especially by this current administration. But perhaps I guess the real issue is how much this will improve productivity of the agricultural sector. And I'm talking about gross domestic product, because if you look at the figures, there's only a 0.015% increase in terms of total output in the agricultural sector in Nigeria in 2022 compared to the entire 2021. You could argue that we're still looking at first quarter 2022 figures. So we would have to get to the end of the entire fiscal year to really look back and see what the improvement has been. But by and large, looking at the total sector, between 2018 to 2022, we see that the agricultural sector is still not bringing as much to the table as it should, and is in some sense, providing much lower than services and industries.
Now, looking at what you just said, you talked about the fact that productivity isn't as much as it should be. And quite frankly, some persons have said several factors are responsible for this. One of that being the Ukraine-Russia war and some other factors, really. But then help us understand more, fundamentally, how much of a challenge the world is faced with, regarding the issue of looming food crisis. Because it would seem to some persons that what we just have is a situation where food prices and commodities are quite high, but they really do not understand what we're talking about. Help us understand what exactly are the real challenges and the outlook here.
Again, I'm going to use Nigeria as the example. So you have several issues that affect the output of the agricultural sector and food security. Food security being defined as the ability of individuals in a country to have economic and physical access to food. So off the top of anyone's head, one thing that would make economic access to food difficult would be inflation. And looking at Nigeria's inflation, which again, you could argue is...
Vayala, can you hear me? All right, he was talking about inflation. Well, quite frankly, he had to bring it down to Nigeria, talking about the challenges in Nigeria. And he already mentioned inflation. And I want to believe he has some other things to say, helping us to paint a clearer picture of what a challenge it is that we are faced with here in Nigeria. Vayala, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. I don't know if you can hear me now.
I can. Please go ahead.
Okay, so looking at inflation that is entering the double digits, 17.10%, if I'm not mistaken, and we see that this will make it much more difficult for the vulnerable groups and for the over 100 million Nigerians that live below the poverty line to have access to food, for example. Looking at the global context again, the Russia-Ukraine crisis in particular has had very, very damaging effects on global food supply in general. And it would interest you to note that the advanced economies spend about 17% of their income on food. Now, when you bear in mind the fact that Russia and Ukraine represent about 30% of the world's total supply of wheat, this brings into context wheat, barley, and other agricultural seeds and crops. You see that the prices of bread, the prices of things like spaghetti, because it's you use flour to make these things from wheat, would definitely increase, and this would further exacerbate inflation and further exacerbate the problem of food security, rendering more and more people insecure. When you look at insecurity as an issue of violence and violent conflict, looking at Nigeria again, the northwest, the northeast, the spate of kidnappings, these also have effects in terms of the supply of agricultural goods. So farmers may even have goods to supply to markets, but simply cannot, provide those goods because of the fear of kidnapping, because of the fear of violence, and it makes the total output at the end of the day much less, in very real terms.
All right, now that you've talked about farmers, we have a report, focusing on Nigeria now, about 56,000 internally displaced household farmers. These are farmers we're talking about here from 28 communities in Borno State who, of course, before now cultivated about 95,000 metric tons of crops yearly. Now they have lost no less than 504,000 metric tons of food since 2015. Looking at this situation, one would say it's a precarious one. But then, do you think the federal government has been responding to this particular challenge, the insecurity?
Yeah, for insecurity in particular, it's difficult to say. Research carried out by my organization last year showed that the budget to the security sector since 2018 has increased. And if you recall, last year, the supplementary budget to the broad national budget.
Mr. Vayala, let me come in here. We totally understand that the government is spending a lot on security, but we are looking at security as it concerns farmers. We have farmers who have now become internally displaced. So the question is, Are there actions geared towards addressing this particular set of people to ensure that food production and supply isn't a problem in the country, looking at what we're faced with?
Oh, I'm so sorry. I seem to have missed the question. Would you mind repeating it?
Okay, I said yes, the government is spending a lot on insecurity, but we're looking at, is the government, targeting farming? Is the government targeting agriculture? Is the government looking at the fact that we have farmers who have become IDPs, and as a result of that, they are not producing as much as they used to, and they have lost over 504,000 tons of food since 2015. Are there targeted instruments towards addressing that particular issue?
Again, you're going to have to look at the fiscal and monetary tools, and then the actual tools to secure these conflict-prone places. The CBN, going by our calculations between 2020 and this year, claimed to have issued out over ₦1 trillion in loans to farmers. So the issue would be to really highlight how much of that has gone to specific farmers in the northeastern region, Borno State in particular, and see if these monies that have been given to these farmers actually have, created a positive impact in terms of how much or how less, conflict is in those particular regions. Again, looking at fiscal tools, we see that the spend of the government on things like irrigation, on things like roads and access to markets is another critical policy tool. How much of that has gone to the Northeast? How much of that has gone to Borno State in particular? And how can we measure accurately, in a realistic fashion? How can we measure the impact of the provision of this fiscal policy tool? Would have to look backwards in terms of how much output from crop production, from livestock, from fisheries, has been or accounts for what was given by the government, in terms of fiscal and monetary tools and policies. But the unfortunate thing about measuring output is that you're always looking backwards to compare one quarter or one fiscal year to the previous one.
All right, thank you so much. I think this is a good place to anchor. Thank you for sharing your thoughts with us on the show today.
Thank you for having me.